Welcome to the very first show of Power Talks with Santosh Sir. On this talk show, we will feature leaders, dignitaries, celebrities, and change makers from around the world. The topics that we will cover will be on global issues, politics, diplomacy, international relations, and of course, development and hope and change. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Robert Piper, who is the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Nepal. United Nations has become inevitable in today's world. It's difficult to imagine a world without the presence of the UN. Directly or indirectly, United Nations has contributed to the development and peace process throughout the world in small ways or big ways. Yes, of course, there are problems everywhere at any given time, but UN works like a common platform for global citizens to come together and seek a solution. In early 2009, we saw a huge crisis that we had never imagined of. That is the global economic crisis. Interestingly, the richer countries, the developed countries, seem to be more affected by this crisis than the developing countries. Your Excellency, Nepal, which is a developing country, should we worry too much about this recent crisis of economy?
Oh, I think we all have to be very worried. I think that it's a very tough year ahead.
Right.
The projections from most of the experts is that we can't really look forward to beginnings of a recovery until the second half of 2010. Most of the projections are for the world economy to either stagnate or grow very slightly. And Nepal can't escape. There is two waves of this. The first wave is very much affecting the banking sector.
Right.
And it's true, Nepal's banking sector is a little bit more sheltered, as they describe themselves, from the global banking system. But the second wave is going to hit the real economy, and that's going to, of course, it's going to hurt Nepal. It may, we're not sure yet what it's going to look like. It may hit remittances. It most likely will hit remittances, which are almost a quarter of the GDP, so that's going to be severe. It may hit tourism. It may hit some of the export markets. So we will have to wait and see, but certainly it may also hit, I should say, aid flows. It's a tough environment to raise resources for development. So we'll have to wait and see what's in store for us. But it's a time for some very sobering thinking about what's ahead.
When you look at Millennium Development Goal, Nepal was very hopeful with the MDG that UN had introduced a few years back. What are the shortcomings? Because the donor countries and the big corporates are quite affected by the economic crisis. So where will we see problems with Nepal's development due to the MDG lacking funds in the future?
Well, I guess the possibilities are in two levels. One, of course, is, and the most important, let's make no mistake, the engine of any economy is not aid, it's the private sector, it's employment. So that the hardest hit to any progress on the MDGs is going to be in terms of employment, in terms of export markets, in terms of reduced tourist arrivals. That's going to hit the MDGs hardest in Nepal if that scenario takes place. At a second level, indeed, globally, Nepal is one of those countries that has not a dependency, but it has a lot of aid flows coming to Nepal, $600 to $700 million a year. It remains to be seen whether globally aid flows start to reduce. Certainly we're seeing in many of the key donor countries for Nepal, countries like the US or UK, much harder discussions in Parliament about protecting their government's aid commitments. The President of the World Bank has tried to maintain an argument that with all these governments making huge stabilization investments into their banking sector, that 0.7% of these programs should also be set aside to protect development assets, to protect development investment.
So we'll see some effects with other donor agencies' aid as well, not just the UN MDG.
We're not seeing any yet, but it's a tough environment. We'll have to just look at this, watch it very carefully. It may well catch up with the aid flows, indeed.
When we think of United Nations, in a time of conflict, in times of war within the country or with neighbors, the general perception is that UN is always there ready with its troop or with its peacekeepers, and it's going to intervene right away. But normally, whenever there's a conflict, we don't see an immediate intervention of the UN. For example, in July 2006, there was a war between Israel and Lebanon. It took 3 weeks for the UN to get to a decision with the Israel and Lebanon war. Who makes these decisions, and why is there such a big lag when such an emergency arises?
Well, at the end of the day, the UN is only as good as its member states want it to be. And a decision like sending in tens of thousands of peacekeepers is a decision that can only be made by the Security Council, and is a very, very high-risk decision. And often, obviously, the result of very complicated political negotiations. The UN will only move when it comes to security and peace when its Security Council has instructed it to do so. That's only one part of the UN. You used the example of Lebanon in 2006. In that 4-week period of the war, the UN was fully deployed in Lebanon. It was protecting humanitarian aid convoys. It was getting assistance to displaced people in the middle of the war, in fact. So one part of the UN, a large part of the UN, was deployed literally overnight. But it's quite true, the peacekeepers only showed up about actually a month after the ceasefire, actually 3 months, I'm sorry, after the ceasefire. But within 3 months, there were about 14,000 peacekeepers on the ground in Lebanon. That's not a bad record. Unfortunately, if you look at places like Darfur or the Congo, the delay is much, much greater. So it's a factor, it's a function of, one, how quickly the Security Council reaches a decision, and then two, when we're talking about peacekeepers, how quickly member states are able to provide actual soldiers to do the work. Nepal, in fact, sent a battalion to Lebanon and was a part of the very early response.
Recently, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visited Nepal, and you obviously played a very important role in that. How much can we expect? How much can Nepal expect out of this trip?
Well, I think the Secretary General came to really underline his commitment to Nepal, his interest in the peace process, his support to the political mission. It was important for him to verify as well what was going on the ground so that he could report back to the Security Council. I think we've already seen a payoff in the sense that the Security Council discussion on the extension of UNMIN, which took place only a couple of weeks ago, was a very positive one. I think, of course, there's a lot of anxieties about some of the outstanding issues that need to take place in the peace process. But on the other hand, member states, I think, were reassured that the UN was properly engaged, was being led well, and the Secretary General could obviously speak firsthand about what he saw. It was a chance for him, of course, to interact with the political leaders and the CA members as well, to underscore his support, and of course to voice some of the warnings for the process ahead, because we're not there yet, obviously.
You've been in Nepal for 1 year, and you'll have 4 more years to go in the country. We'll talk more about your works, your life, after a short break. We'll see you after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Power Talks with Santosh Shah. Your Excellency, President Bill Clinton is one of the most famous or renowned presidents of the United States ever. You had the opportunity to work as Chief of Staff in the Special Envoy of the UN in Indonesia in 2005, which was led by former President Bill Clinton. How was the experience like working with him?
That was fantastic. Yeah, I had 2 years with him. He agreed, Kofi Annan asked him whether he would lead the international effort to respond to the tsunami, because it was such a massive challenge and it spread across so many countries. And President Clinton agreed he would do it for 2 years. So we set up an office to support him in that capacity in New York, actually, not in Indonesia. We covered the whole Indian Ocean from there. It was a great experience. It really, he's an amazing person, the most natural politician, someone who's just so genuinely interested in people, that it was very inspiring, obviously, to see how he operated and to get a chance to get to know him a little, yeah.
You are an expert on recovery of natural disasters and conflict. Just last year in August, we had a very sad incident in Nepal. We had the Kosi flood that displaced about 70,000 people in Nepal and a few million in India. Now, with your experience of dealing with tsunami relief, working with President Bill Clinton, where do we find your expertise useful and the UN involvement in the recovery of Kosi flood victims?
Well, I have a number of jobs in Nepal. One of them is as the humanitarian coordinator for the UN system. So when it comes to the emergency response on the international side, not only UN, but a number of the big non-government organizations like Save the Children and working with the Red Cross, my role is to make sure that we respond very quickly as a team. So we did that in Koshi, I think, between the World Food Programme and UNICEF and others. We did respond very quickly in support of the government systems, because the government also moved very quickly, I feel, and did a pretty good job. My role, in addition to that, is really to look at how we could have avoided the casualties and how to help the government start to shift not only into an emergency response mode, which it does now, but to also think much more proactively about how to reduce every year the number of casualties.
Because this problem could arise next year as well, with the monsoon coming up.
1,000 Nepalis on average die every year from a natural disaster. The Koshi was an absolute, an example of a disaster that did not need to happen, and it was a man-made crisis, not an act of God. But there are many like it, not nearly as visible as Koshi, which displaced 3 million people in Bihar as well. So it was a very visible catastrophe. But every year, all over the country, from mudslides to floods to food insecurity, there are ways in which this government, with support of its outside friends, can act proactively to reduce this suffering in advance. And that's a whole mindset shift which is now really only starting to take root in Nepal, and that's a big priority for me, is to push that process along.
How much will the Nepal and India relations or communications affect the effectiveness of your project? If you have to take the recovery resources to the Tarai part of Nepal, where Bihar also kind of comes into the same operation of flood recovery, do you think that will affect the process?
Oh, it's not sensitive at all to say that Nepal's water management process in the Tarai is heavily dependent on an effective relationship with its neighbour. The more effective your relationship is with your neighbour, the better things work. And certainly climate change, all these kinds of issues, water management, are ones that need to be done in very close collaboration with your friends in the neighbourhood.
Like, you've come to Nepal in a very difficult time. We had conflict. We still have an ongoing conflict, which is not yet taken very seriously by the government. We have intense poverty right now. In the past, probably a decade ago, we had rather a peaceful, and the poverty was not as visible as it is right now. How is your family life and your personal life in Nepal when you have to deal with so many problems with the power cut and with the issues that bothers an individual every day?
Well, I have an amazing family that's travelled around the world for 20 years with me. We've been moving from different countries together. Every place we've lived in has fantastic charms, and every place we live in has its disadvantages as well. We came from New York before Kathmandu. It's a tough place for little kids to live, actually, New York. Kathmandu in many ways is a much easier place for young children. So we're loving getting settled here. We're still getting settled.
Have you traveled a bit in Nepal?
I've travelled a lot to the Tarai, not enough up now into the hills and mountains. It's really my priority to also see a little bit more of Nepal. We have just for a few weeks on holiday to the hills around Pokhara and done some trekking, if that's what you're talking about. Yeah. But I'm still excited to get to see more of the country, and Karnali, of course, is perhaps the most important area that I haven't explored at all yet. So that's my big priority for 2009.
I hope you have great travels here, because you have very good natural beauty. Like 2 decades ago, when you're still in college, you did your acting courses in France. You could have got into like films, and France is very known for its arts, fashion, which is probably more exciting, glamorous world. You chose to be a diplomat, which is a great thing as well. But sometimes doesn't it get pretty boring because of the paperwork, meetings? I mean, I'm quite surprised that why would you choose from a glamorous field, almost getting into a glamorous field, which almost every youth aspires to get into something very serious, which is the United Nations. What inspired you? How did that happen?
Well, exciting. What's exciting? I mean, to have worked on some of the places I've worked, like helping Cambodia through its peace process, helping Kosovo through its peace process, working with Nepal on the transition to peace process. I mean, I think, that's incredibly exciting, and is for many people pretty glamorous too. I mean, I don't think it's particularly glamorous, but it's certainly very exciting. I did have a previous life as an actor, and I played a lot of music, and it was very important to me. I still occasionally play music. It's very important to me to have some sort of creative
Which instrument do you use?
exploits. I play the guitar badly, but I play it for pleasure, not for performance.
I've been to several countries in the world. I studied in Australia and US and France, and traveled with development works to different countries. How do you see Nepal's future? Because we have problems, but also it's a unique country. We're in between India and China, which is a growing economy. So do you see like Nepal has a different case study in terms of its future?
Oh, every peace process is unique, and every development process is unique. You know, Nepal has many advantages developmentally, and some people describe it as being squashed between India and China, but actually it's an incredible opportunity to find yourself between these two giants with such fast-growing economies. The big question in Nepal, of course, is the peace process going to continue, and is it going to be sustained? I think we've been here as the United Nations since 1951 in Nepal as development workers, and yet Nepal's development indicators are still some of the worst in the world, and they are the worst in South Asia. So I've been thinking very hard about that since I arrived, about all my predecessors and all the work and the energy and the resources that have gone into Nepal's development efforts. So I'm excited to be here right now, because it seems Nepalis have agreed it's time to do the open heart surgery that maybe Nepal needs. It's a very exciting time. It's a risky operation, like any open heart surgery. But I like to think that if Nepalis get this right, together we can achieve more in the next 10 years than we've been able to do in the last 20.
This is very interesting, open heart surgery of Nepal to fix it. We'll talk more about your works and the current role of the United Nations in Nepal after a short break. We'll see you after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Power Talks with Santosa. Your Excellency, when it comes to the UN's role in Nepal's development, its peace process, sometimes we are confused because we have UNMIN, which is probably the predominant UN agency in Nepal right now, and we have the UN and its several agencies, and then we also have OHCHR. Can you please explain us the differences and the specifications of the UN agencies?
Well, we're a big group. I mean, I like to say all of the UN's assets are deployed in Nepal, at Nepal's request, obviously. It's political and security assets, and that's, of course, UNMIN. It's human rights team with OHCHR, the whole development, and all the humanitarian actors of the UN are pretty much present in Nepal. UNMIN, as you say, is the most important presence of the UN today because of the very important historical peace process that Nepal is in the middle of. It's come with a Security Council mandate. It has a very specific mission. My part of the UN, which is the development and the humanitarian part of the UN, is not a political mission as such, but rather it is very much all about the peace. Our mandate and our work is very much organized around supporting Nepal's peace process. But our function, if you will, is to make sure that the root causes of the conflict are addressed. For that reason, our presence is a much longer term one. We've been here for almost 60 years. We may be here another 50 or whatever, as long as Nepal wants us to be around. But our function now is to really look at whether the underlying causes of the conflict are being addressed, and therefore the peace process, is it going to stick or not? And we support the government, the people of Nepal, in making sure that happens. Obviously, the Office of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights has another. It's very much a part of that team, in fact, because the underlying issues, the long-term issues about human rights, about impunity, are issues that are going to take a generation to really address properly.
So it's going to take a longer while.
It's the
human rights issues, because
the human rights issues are, yeah, I think the issues of impunity. When you start to unpack the issues that are in fact laid out in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, this is not a UN agenda, but when you look at the CPA and the issues that the kind of Nepal that the parties to the CPA want to build, issues to do with, addressing this culture of impunity, establishing human rights on a much firmer footing, shall we say, These are things that are, when you unpack them, it's about rule of law, it's about the effectiveness of the police, it's about the effectiveness of the judicial system, it's about the status of women, not only in Parliament, but in the home even, an extent to which they have property in their name. These are all, I mean, enormously complex and long-term issues. They're economic, they're social, they're cultural issues that are going to be tough to deal with. So, yeah, all of these issues, these root cause issues, are long-term undertakings.
Your Excellency, with the UNMIN dominating the UN's role in Nepal, at least in the media and in public's eye, now with the UNMIN going in a few months from now, how will the UN see its future challenges and prospects in Nepal's development?
The future of UNMIN is yet to be written. All we know today is that it's just had an extension of its mandate up till the middle of this year. So let's see what happens next. But irrespective of that scenario, the UN's engagement in Nepal's peace process isn't going to waver. We are and we have to be committed for the long term. Certainly, as the peace process shifts gear into a new phase, different parts of the UN system are coming forward to assume their responsibilities. And my UN family, the development actors in particular, now really moving into centre stage because that's where Nepal needs us. Up till now, the preoccupation has been with security issues, for example, arms monitoring. But I think the next phase of the peace process, my sense is going to be more and more about the tangible changes in people's lives that need to happen to make sure that the transition is sustained. So we've been talking about arms monitors now, up till now. More and more we're going to be talking about issues like food security, about the quality of education, the types of fundamental priorities for parents and students all over Nepal. And that's where my part of the UN family has to deliver its peace dividend.
Now, we are at a very historic time in Nepal. Our new constitution is being written. And as you know, with your one stay in Nepal, politicians are not that too serious sometimes. How will UN play an important role in getting it drafted on time or helping the constitution writers to write a good constitution that takes Nepal way ahead in the future in comparison to other countries around the world?
Well, only Nepalis can write Nepal's constitution. That's very clear. So you're going to have to keep your expectations high of your politicians. But we like to say as well, writing a constitution is far too important to be left only to politicians. So I think that's very exciting. But it's very clear at the end of the day, the international community is very much lined up to support Nepal in its constitution writing process. What we can do is we can bring the experience of the world to Nepal's doorstep, or we can take some Nepalis to see, obviously, that experience around the world. We've also been supporting it as the UN, this outreach effort, so to make sure that logistics and things like that don't become an obstacle for a CA member that wants to go out there and listen to his or her constituency. CA members can do all kinds of training. But at the end of the day, all we can do is provide support. We certainly can't be doing any writing for Nepalis.
Last year we had outburst of Madhes Andolan. Now when it comes to the new constitution, the issues of Dalits, Janjatis and Madhesis has to be in a way addressed properly. What is the UN role right now in trying to address their issues in a serious way?
There's no outside solution to Nepalese problems, and it's not for us to be writing any constitution. Where we are not agnostic, if you will, is in the importance of making sure that Nepal's quieter voices are heard. So we do take an active role, if you will, and it's an important path for us to take to be aware of that. We also think, and this is not an original idea, this is a Nepali idea because it's in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, that the peace will not be successful in Nepal if the issues of the Dalits, of the Janjatis, these issues of equity, of access, of fairness, just pure fairness and justice, if those issues are not successfully addressed in this constitution-making process, then Nepal may not leave behind this period of civil unrest. It's paid a very high price for that in terms of development progress or lack of it. And we want Nepal to succeed developmentally. And for Nepal to succeed developmentally, the Constitution, of course, has to make sure that these underlying structural issues are properly addressed.
When we talk about the unheard voices being heard, you recently came up with the vision, you and your team, of UNYAP, United Nations Youth Advisory Panel. Youth was unheard in Nepal. We were used, the youths in Nepal were used by the politicians for their own vested interest, but not necessarily their own issues were heard. How did you come up with this vision, and what are the expectations out of UNYAP?
The Youth Advisory Panel came out of a sense amongst the UN country team, these 22 UN agencies, that we weren't doing very well when it came to youth. We were very conscious that this was a key group, that there were 300,000 young people joining or trying to join the workforce every year pretty much without too many prospects, with the potential of young people being exploited in a sense by many different forces for all the wrong reasons. And that our response at the UN wasn't good enough, quite frankly, and so the panel was above all a recognition that we needed to do better, and we needed to get the advice of some kind of representation of young people from around Nepal. But this panel, we believe, is going to be part of our secret to success.
We do hope that during your next 4 years, we are able to achieve a lot from the UN, from your leadership. And with this hope, I wish you good luck and goodbye. See you next week. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.